Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Professor Cathal Nolan. I'll tell you all about Professor in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. And when you do it from a leadership standpoint, you do it to bring people together for common cause. And as you'll know from today's program, we're going to have a very special program. We're going to explore the topic of mercy. Welcome, Cathal Nolan.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
I want to tell everybody about you. You are a professor at Boston University, and you're the author of many, many, many books. And your newest book is Mercy, Humanity in War, which, I'll be honest with you, sounds a little bit like an oxymoron, but it isn't, because you will tell us some interesting things. You are a prize-winning historian. You have lectured throughout the world, but also to the Chautauqua Marine Corps University, World War II Museum, and the U.S. Army War College. Once I taught there too. And you also had a stint teaching young diplomats in Kabul in 2011. You've been interviewed on international radio, CBS, Radio Free Europe, BBC, you name it. And so it's a pleasure to have you, Cathal Nolan. So
thank you.
Great. As I said, mercy as in war, seems to be an oxymoron. But you bring us up right into that. In the conclusion to your book, you have a terrific story about an officer, Craig, who's a Special Forces veteran, who was being choked by an Iraqi teenager. Tell us what happened.
Okay, this was in Iraq, northern Iraq, in the Kurdish area in the, I'm not sure exactly the year, it was the mid to late 1990s. He told me the story almost 20 years later. He was part of a four-man insertion team. They were in pickup trucks, two pickup trucks. And they had just pulled into a Kurdish village. And what always happens when you slow down as they pulled into a friendly Kurdish village is the children ran up to the trucks, with hands out and excitedly looking for things that only Americans had, bubble gum and candy and things like that. And the soldiers started, tossing candies and chocolate and gum out the window of the trucks. And the children scrambled around and picked them up. The trucks didn't really stop. They just sort of slowed down and kept rolling. Well, this very large, for his age, Craig, the man's name was Craig, and he said I could share it. He was a master sergeant, and he was driving one of the pickups, and this young lad jumped on the running board of the pickup truck. This was a very large child for a 15-year-old, very strong, powerful, and mentally handicapped. And he had sort of been out-scrambled by all the faster, smaller children. He wanted candy. He wanted candy justice. And he reached in. He jumped up on the running board, and he put both his hands around Craig's throat. And he was kind of howling. And this went on. The obvious thing to do is stop the truck, and so on. But you don't think about that. You're in a combat zone. You've got weapons all around. People have been killed the day before and will be killed the day after, and so on. And Craig told me the story in my office, and he was slowly losing breath, and came close to losing consciousness, and he thought that he was going to get choked to death. And he reached down and pulled out his sidearm, and he lifted it up and he put it at the boy's. He put it at the boy's temple, and then he looked at me and he said, and I think it's the single most morally eloquent thing a soldier has ever said to me. Anyway, he said, "I chose not to pull the trigger." And it was that story that really launched me on this search for mercy in war. I'd written about war, and I'd written about, not so much about combat, but I've written, academic histories of war and so on. So I wanted to go looking for, mercy and out there, humanity, if you prefer a different term. And that's what led to this book. I went looking for mercy, and I do have to tell you, I didn't find as much of it as I was hoping.
Well, you found it. And the story, what peppers your story is, I mean, you have a broad view of history and the combat you talk about it, but you discuss it from many different angles. U.S., allies, the French, you have different populaces in here. And then the book is divided into 4 parts, which are culture, combat, protected, and technology. We'll discover each one. Let's start with culture, because my audience we're all about organizational culture and things. So what forms the culture of war, Cathal?
Well, I think it's a truism, and I think most military historians would agree with this, that armies, navies, armed forces reflect the societies that organize them, fund them, populate them, and send them off to kill in our name. So, I mean, for want of a better term, I think it's a good one, military culture. And there's not just one military culture. There's an American military culture. There was a German military culture. There's clearly a Red Army, or Russian, rather, military culture. There's a culture of guerrillas. There's a culture of, of the Taliban. I mean, these things vary. So I think it's a good term. It's not one that a lot of people in my profession would actually naturally gravitate to. The idea of culture and war, they don't understand it. That's because most of my colleagues don't read military history. They don't study war. They're missing a great deal, actually, of human affairs and of the human story. So that's the main thing.
So often throughout many of these stories, and we'll explore some of them, there's actually acts of heroism. And there's one, I think, right up front where you talk about Hugh Thompson, which many of our viewers will know about. He was the at My Lai helicopter pilot just after the slaughter, placed his helicopter between the soldiers and the remaining civilians. So tell us that story, because he went back to Vietnam, did he not? Many years later.
30 years later. 30 years later, he went back to Vietnam. He went back to My Lai, and he met some of the survivors, including one woman who had been a small child, and now, at 30 years on, a mother herself and so forth. And she came up and asked him, after he had met them and they had spoken, why he had not come back with the people who had done this thing to their village. She knew who he was. And before he could explain, she then said, so that we could forgive them. And he was absolutely overwhelmed by it. He really got. Now, then he went back to the United States, where he got renewed death threats. The 3 members of that crew, they received death threats. They were ostracized by many of their fellow officers.
Right.
The country rejected them more than it accepted them, and so on. And I use that story as one among many that illustrates that one of the paradoxes about moral heroism in war is that if it happens on your own side, you're less likely to hear about it because governments will suppress it. Because if Thompson is doing this, interceding and doing this incredibly morally heroic act, well, then somebody in our uniform was doing a war crime, which he was attempting to stop. And that interferes with the narrative, that interferes with the propaganda line, that interferes with the portrayal of the war to folks back home. Right. They don't want to hear it anyway, for the most part.
Right. Now, there is a story in here that was new to me, certainly, and it's happened in World War I. The French poilu, the soldier, was Corporal Louis Bartas, and he did a diary. Tell us about his mindset he was a World War I veteran fighting in the fighting in the trenches. So what was his initial attitude toward war in general, Cathal?
Well, he like everyone else in 1914, he was a socialist. He was a working guy. He was I think he was a barrel maker. I think he was a barrel maker for the wine trades. But most of the French working class was social democratic, and he went off to war like everyone else, conscripted into the army. But he went off to war believing that France had been invaded and that he was defending his country. I think you could think of him as the average Ukrainian today. And he went off, but But as the war went on, and we'll watch for this in Ukraine, as the war went on, he became more and more disenchanted with the French officer corps. The sort of the cliche will become the chateau generals. For the British, the phrase is lions led by donkeys. That kind of thing.
Yes, I heard that.
Every army had this sort of the contempt of the officer corps. But the story is it started in 1915 for him. He was in the entire war. He survived. He was there for all 4 years. He was in almost all of the major battles. Verdun, the Somme in 1916, Champagne, first Champagne, second Champagne. I mean, he was in terrible, terrible battles, and he killed Germans. There's no question. I mean, he's not a pacifist. But over time, and this is very common in war, his unit, himself, in his own views, and other men in his unit came to have a kind of live and let live attitude toward the Germans across the line. So they would not shoot at each other when they were going to the latrine. If they saw a man exposed out of the trench, they would. I mean, it's just basic decency. Right. They would not fire at each other's working parties, work details. They would actually, call out and say work detail over here. And there's kind of these little sort of totally unofficial, semi-negotiated, usually just almost by hand gesture, little local ceasefires. Well, there were tens of thousands of such incidents.
And I think you write, and maybe not this story, but others where there was opportunities to remove the dead or at least severely wounded without being fired upon?
Yeah, the two most common, as far as I can tell, the two most common causes of local truces in war, and we're talking very temporary, they might last an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours. I mean, the more spectacular ones are the so-called Christmas truce of 1914 and so forth. But much more common, there are two major causes. One is very frequently initiated, but not always, by medical officers on one side and agreed to by medical officers on the other, and that's to go out and collect each other's wounded. So you have this bizarre moral circumstances where we're trying to maim and kill you, and then we will pause this kind of a mutual return to decency for a set period of time. We go out and recover the wounded, and often we'll carry your wounded to you, and you'll help carry our wounded back, and so forth. And then we resume trying to kill and maim you. The other major cause of these kind of limited local truces is agreements to go out and collect the dead. And again, there's a sense of the indecency of leaving dead men. Or checking that they are dead, but to collect the dead. Very common, often initiated in World War II. I mean, often initiated by the Germans.
Right. And speaking of that, you have a story that surprised me. It happened in the Ardennes Forest, in the Battle of the Bulge, where the Germans' last great offensive, if we could call it that, into Belgium. Tell us the story of Friedrich Langenfeld, Wehrmacht. Was he an officer?
He was a lieutenant, a young lieutenant. He was 23 years old. Just a quick, small correction. It was actually in the Hürtgen Forest, just preceding the Battle of the Bulge. A dreadful, worst defeat of the U.S. Army in World War II. Terrible battle, badly commanded, terrible casualties for the Americans. Division after division sent in serial fashion and just chewed up. Well, what happened was there had been a fight the night before. It's a wooded area. It's the Hürtgen Forest. And there had been a fight that was actually centered around a forester's hut. So the Americans and the Germans were fighting over control of a forester's hut. This is an unlighted, unheated forester's hut in the middle of, anyway, the Germans managed to push the Americans back. And the next morning, the Germans are in position. They're waiting for the next American assault. And they hear this moaning and cries for help coming from a minefield that is a few hundred yards outside their line. It's an American, and the man is moaning and crying in English. It goes on for many hours. Young Langenfeld, 23 years old, sends a runner who survived and told us this story years later, decades later, sends a runner to his machine gun position to say, if American medics come out to rescue this man, do not shoot. And then they all waited for the American medics to arrive. And they waited hour after hour after hour, listening to this man who was clearly in agony, and no medics came until they concluded the American medics must be out of earshot. They can't hear him. They don't know he's there. So in the broad daylight, Langfield organized a rescue party. They, put, white cloths on tree branches, pine tree branches, and the ends of rifles and so on. And they went out with a stretcher to bring in this American to give him what succor they could. And just as they approached him, Langfield, this 23-year-old officer who was leading this German rescue party of a wounded American, stepped on a mine. And he wasn't killed immediately. I think I noted in the book, I think the inanimate is unmerciful. Only the animate are capable of mercy. So he suffered for 8 hours. He had multiple puncture wounds. He will eventually die. The Germans bring him back and so on. 50 years later, on the 50th anniversary of the Hurtgen Forest battle in 1994, the American who had commanded the colonel, that actually was I don't remember his rank, I think he might have been a general, but anyway, by later in his career, but he had commanded the American forces at that time on that day, and he organized other American veterans, and at their own expense, they flew back across the Atlantic. They went to the Hurtgen Forest. They paid for, erected, and dedicated a monument to Herbert Langfield.
An extraordinary story. Mercy on both sides, especially for the young German officer. And that's in your section of the book called Combat. Your another section is called Protected, and that's the non-combatants, which are everything, as you described, from prisoners to medics, prisoners, as well as civilians. And some practice mercy and some are shown mercy. What's the bigger picture of that? Protected.
Well, first of all, those three categories. I mean, prisoners has been a traditional category, and you can go back in history and find, examples of both the abuse of prisoners and the respect for prisoners and so forth. Prisoners of war, historically, however, have been a pretty transactional. It still is. I mean, why do you accept the other side's surrender? It's because if you're going to insist on killing everyone on the other side, he's going to fight you to the death, and it's going to cost you more of your own life. I mean, it's just pretty transactional for the most part. It's not actually governed by law or mercy. But those three categories are enshrined in international law, in modern international law, which has only been 150 years old or so. So we have protections of prisoners of war, and sometimes these are respected. I think more often than not, they are not respected. Nurses and medics. Nurses, this was also a way of introducing women into the discussion of modern warfare. Although that's not their only role, the book also goes on to talk about modern Western armies and women in combat. But the odd one is medics. I think most people think of medics as being protected, and then under law they are. In practice, sometimes they are. But let's just go back to World War II, the war that probably most people are most familiar with. There was virtually no respect for each other's medics in the Pacific Theater at all. And even in Europe, where you have this kind of almost it's cliche, almost amounting to a myth, that the Germans were more law-abiding and respectful, and therefore, at least with the Western partners, not with the Russians, Western allies, so that they were more respectful of these laws. And it's somewhat true. Even the U.S. Medical Service, U.S. Army medical history of the medical service will record that the Germans were reasonably respectful of this until the end of 1944. Those big battles in the Hurtgen and the Bulge, and then the invasion of Germany itself. American soldiers began to refer to the white circle and the red cross on the medic's helmet as aiming stakes. Because in fact, it's a myth that people don't shoot at medics. Medics are actually often specially targeted, because you shoot the medic, the guys on the other side are coming out to get him. I mean, he's a beloved man usually in the unit. They're coming out to get him, and you shoot them too.
Well, I mean, that really, and I like how you do it, because what you're doing is you're puncturing, if I may say so, the mythology of war, and there's always the romance of combat until we see the casualties come home and experience them in one way or another. And so that's why your book is so important, in my opinion. One of the many reasons, because you discuss the horror of a war in very human terms. So now you have a section called technology. So, and I think you have submarines, airfare,
war at sea, war in the air, cyber war. Those are the new technologies.
Does technology make killing easier.
Yes.
Okay.
But this is I mean, if you go back, not too far back in history, I'm an historian, so for me, not too far back is about 500 years. So, but, if you go back classically in history, there were only so many ways to kill a man. You could stab him, you could club him, you could slash him, and so you could shoot him.
Okay, most of our audience has seen Vikings, so
well, there you go. I mean, that's actually, think about that. Actually, I mean, you could there are certain missiles you could throw a javelin or you could fire a bow, but it's pretty limited distance. But most killing was done with the man within arm's reach, up close, personal, with his screams in your ears, his blood all over you, and his viscera falling onto your boots. That's the reality of war. Except about 300 years ago, we started moving more and more combatants further and further away as long-distance projectile weapons, artillery, comes on the battlefield. Let's just round it off and say the 18th century. And it was like about a mile. Well, a mile's distance is a significant moral distance compared to an arm's length distance. That was in, say, 1750. By the time, or even 1800, by the time you get to World War I, we're talking about artillery. The artillerymen don't see who they're killing. They're firing from 7-8 kilometers, some guns 10, 15 kilometers distance. World War II, they're shooting from, 10 to 12, 13, 14 miles. Now with HIMARS, what are we shooting? 120 miles. And this isn't even talking about flying artillery, bombers, and so forth. But yes, it does increase. So the distance of an air crew looking down at this ghoulish green haze through a World War II bomb site. They don't see a city. They don't see 1,000 years of endeavors. They don't see neighborhoods and families. They see a target, and they didn't believe that they didn't really understand what they were doing. And decades later, when they were told, it was actually our policy to openly bomb cities, and we were targeting civilians. It wasn't collateral damage. We were targeting them by 44, 45. Right. They didn't want to hear it, and their families didn't want to hear it.
And that statement, or what you just said, links into something you have written in the book. In your conclusion, you say, mercy and cruelty intertwine in war. Acts of compassion may coexist with pitiless depravity within just a few yards or miles, as you have said. I think this kind of illustrates the horror and the craziness of the reality of war today. What's your thoughts on that, Cathal? So
I think war always. I mean, I don't think its essentials have changed, and that's why I say technology. I think people be very careful thinking that technology fundamentally changes war. Technology changes war on the margins. Everybody else catches up. They get the technology. It evens out. It's kind of a double helix kind of evolution of technologies. But morally, I don't think war has really changed at all. I wrote this book the way I teach, I have to say, which is my courses are not traditional history courses or traditional military history courses. I really even don't think of them sometimes as courses in history. I think of them as courses in the human condition. Not all students can handle that. I have to tell you, it's a sort of transactional generation and becoming more so. It's getting harder and harder to reach them, even with these sort of deeply humanistic approaches. There's a certain percentage of them just say, what's on the final? Just what's on the final? What's all this damn stuff? You actually want me to think?
Right. Well, you got me to think, I'll tell you that. So I know I would enjoy your course. And toward that end, so you have lectured to military audiences. What lessons have they drawn from your work that they tell you?
I would say that depends on rank, to be honest, because people over the level of colonel and general, I've been told, have read some of my books. This one's fairly new, so I don't know about this one yet. Yeah. And have had responses to it varying from, since the Ukraine war started, this is not normal. This has not been normal in my career, but I've been invited in the past 13 months multiple times to consult with some pretty high level future war planning group in Austin, and even had an online session where I was the only one on screen because I was the only one who didn't have classified clearing. Everybody else was blacked out, which was really weird. With the Secretary of Defense office, sort of future war planning group there. And they were trying to, so most of the people, there was a general online, there were a couple of more senior officers online, but most of these guys were majors, captains, lieutenant colonel, which means they've spent the last 20 years of their careers at war. They get it. They don't need me to tell them anything.
Right.
They get it. It's the general who still walks into the president's office, whoever the president is, and says, "Sir, I have a plan." That's the problem.
Sure.
I think one does hope that these young officers who are coming up, the ranks, have seen so much of war that they have more hesitation about this. Although one of the worrying things was, one of the things that they were asking me about was, my previous book was really about wars of attrition and how you get trapped in wars of attrition. You think you're going to launch a short, sharp, decisive war and you get bogged down. Think Russians. Okay, think Russians. A year ago, it's a classic case, and that's kind of why they wanted to talk to me last August and so forth in Washington. But they weren't asking the right question, I thought. I mean, my writing, as far as it matters at all, is a warning against don't depend on your plan. It's going to fail. And I told them, your plan A is going to fail. You better have a plan B. That's likely to fail. You better have a plan C, and so on. But they weren't asking me how to avoid wars of attrition, which is what I write about, basically. They were asking me, how do you win a war of attrition?
Well, that's their job.
How the hell do I know? That's not my job. I'm not a professional military officer. That's your job. That's tactics and operations. And, at a strategic level, avoid them almost at all costs. But you're probably almost certainly going to recognize you're going to get bogged down in them. You're going to think the next one's going to be fast. It's not going to be fast, because in the way the international system is now, any war starts with any of the major powers, immediately goes to coalition warfare, and coalitions can sustain the fight for years.
Yeah, that's for sure. So, we're coming to the end of our show, and I always ask every guest a story about grace. And your whole book is, frankly, grace, to be honest with you. Excuse me.
And cruelty, though.
Humanity in war. But do you have a personal story you'd like to share, Cathal?
Well, as I said to you before we went on air, I'm not religious in any manner, so I don't claim any contact with grace in the way that religious folk would use that term. If there is a form of secular grace, I would say I found it in my 20s when I was out in Nigeria, rural northern Nigeria, Muslim northern Nigeria, an area I could not go back to now because it's Boko Haram country, and Boko Haram meaning Western education is forbidden. I was an educator. At any rate, but I remember I had a motorcycle. I was 22 years of age. You're on the edge of the Sahara, and when you're in the rainy season of the desert, the rain comes down. It's got no place to go, and it was like so. Bike conked out, I'm drenched, I'm pushing this thing through sand that's the consistency of Somme mud, and so on. And a family called me over. I was passing a little village, and I spent the evening and the night in a grass roof, single room family dwelling where they shared everything they had with me. They shared their meal with me. I mean, that was, I think, for me, a remarkable moment. I've had comparable moments working with students in Honduras where we were building rural infrastructure, digging trenches for water systems and so on. But it's always when you interact with people at that level, and the poorest of the poor. I mean, northern Nigeria was pretty poor. Honduras was even worse. Working in a local soup kitchen. These kind of things are the moments I come closest to what I would call secular grace, but it's not me, it's them. It's the interaction with these extraordinarily decent people who have so much less than you have. I was going to leave Nigeria. I was going to leave Honduras. I go home after I work in the soup kitchen. Yeah. I mean, it's not at all the same. It's deeply rewarding, however, among other things, because they ain't at all like my stiff colleagues.
That is a powerful. It's a powerful story of grace, and I will say that you've returned that grace certainly in your work, and certainly in this terrific book, Mercy, Humanity in War. It's a powerful read. It's evocative, emotional at times, but it's so well told, and you get inside the experience, but also there's a detachment to it that gives us a handle on it. So, Cathal, Nolan, it has been such a pleasure to have you. How can people find you? I think the book is available everywhere, but
yeah, it's on Amazon or Oxford University Press's website. Me personally, I don't maintain a website, but you could. There is a page for me on Boston University's website.
Great. And I will put that link in the page. Professor Cathal Nolan, it has been an honor to interview you today. Thank you for your great work. And with that, we're going to be out.
Thank you very much, sir.